New chair. So in continuing with our very loose theme of October, what could be more frightening than a grim portrayal of the future? In 1982, Ridley Scott gave us just that, giving us a very gritty, urban, and smog-filled Los Angeles in the year 2019 in his movie entitled Blade Runner. We see a vision of the future where technology has advanced so far that we have androids that are so human-like that it's almost impossible to tell them apart from actual humans. These androids, known simply as replicants, have superhuman strength and the intelligence of their designers. In other words, the intelligence of a smarter-than-average human. And they have been deemed too dangerous to be allowed on Earth, and so they are essentially used for slave labor off-world. And a special force known as Blade Runners are set the task of finding these replicants and killing them or retiring them. And with a premise like that, how can you not be interested? So let's take a look at number 97 on AFI's Top 100 list to find out what's all the fuss about.
Remember,
you're a wizard.
On second thought, let's not go camera.
Still princesses.
Time travel. As you wish.
Do you like our owl?
It's artificial?
Of course it is.
Must be expensive.
Very. I'm Rachel.
Deckard.
It seems you feel our work is not a benefit to the public.
Replicants are like any other machine. They're either a benefit or a hazard.
Every so often on the AFI list I'll come across a movie that surprises me a little bit. Yankee Doodle Dandy comes to mind, as well as a Marx Brothers movie. There's actually a Marx Brothers movie on this list. That's not what we're looking at now. The Marx Brothers movie is number 70-something. No, we're looking at Blade Runner, which is a sci-fi film, another type of film that you really wouldn't expect to see on this list. And I'll admit, when I first started researching Blade Runner and was kind of looking at the premise, it didn't seem like anything altogether special. And if you look at the story itself, it's really not. The characters are pretty two-dimensional, the story is actually pretty commonplace, and the message is exactly what you'd expect. There's not really any surprises here. You can find pretty much the same plot and characters in an Isaac Asimov story. In addition, you've got Harrison Ford playing the main character of Deckard. And I really can't say that I'm altogether crazy about his acting in this movie. And it's not that he's not playing a character he hasn't played many times before. I mean, Deckard actually has a lot in common with Han Solo and Indiana Jones. Kind of the dry, dour, mysterious figure with a dark past and a chip on his shoulder but a heart of gold type of character. The difference is that in Indiana Jones and Star Wars, that character was kind of played up more for comedy. And here, it's not. There's really not a single funny moment for this character, and Harrison Ford kind of specializes in playing that type of character over the top so that it's funny. There's also the matter of which version you see, and Blade Runner has had a lot of re-releases since its initial release in 1982. I watched two versions of the movie. I watched the original theatrical cut, and I watched the final cut, or the 25th anniversary re-release in 2007. And one of the main differences between the two is that in the original theatrical cut, there's narration in the background. Ridley Scott did not originally want to put that narration in. He was pressured by the producers to do so because of a poor preview and because they were afraid that the audience wasn't going to get it unless there was narration. And they did kind of have a point, but more on that in a moment. And as many movie critics have already pointed out, the narration is pretty much redundant and unnecessary. Much like saying redundant and unnecessary. But my problem isn't so much that the narration is redundant, my problem is that you can definitely tell that neither Harrison Ford nor Ridley Scott wanted to do this narration. The narration comes off as incredibly half-assed because it's incredibly half-assed. And it's hard to say whether or not the movie would have been improved if they'd actually tried, but it couldn't have hurt. The 2007 final cut did not include the narration, and you really don't miss it. So okay, I've spent the first half of the review bashing it, so you might be asking yourself, what's all the fuss about? Well, there's one aspect of this movie that pretty much makes up for the mediocre aspects of the rest of the film. And that is the visual style. This is a movie that's pretty short on words. There's not a lot of dialogue. The dialogue that is there is pretty straightforward, and aside from the narration, the story is almost exclusively told from the visuals. But more than that, this movie creates an almost palpable atmosphere. Everything in it, the lighting style, the cinematography, the detail of the sets and the backgrounds, everything really creates this vivid image of Los Angeles in 2019. There's also a lot of symbolism throughout the movie, and it is incredibly effective. The visuals really do tell the story, to the point that the script almost writes itself. If you kind of want to get an idea of what I'm talking about, try watching this film with the sound muted. Watch it only with the visuals and no audio. If you're really paying attention to the visuals, you will pretty much get the entire story without having to hear anything. And I think that's what a lot of critics had a problem with in 1982. This movie doesn't tell you a whole lot, but it shows you pretty much everything. And I think that's also why the American Film Institute felt compelled to put it on the top 100 list. The second time around, it wasn't on the original list. To say nothing of the fact that sci-fi films since seem to have drawn a lot of inspiration from this movie. All that being said, while I do understand what the fuss is about, I don't know that I necessarily share it. Don't get me wrong, the visuals are fantastic, probably some of the best I've ever seen in a movie, and it really does use the visual medium to its fullest advantage. But while I admire how the story is told, I kind of wish that the story itself had been a little bit more creative. But that's not to say that I think that the story or the movie is bad. They certainly are not. It might take you a couple of viewings to really get everything, and the storytelling style can come off as a little bit muddled and confused, but that's just because you really have to pay attention to this movie. It's not something that you can just casually have on in the background. You really have to watch and pick up on the visuals, and it might take 2 or 3 times to really pick up on everything. So I do think that this is a good movie despite the somewhat mediocre story that it's telling, and on the worth meter, I'd give this a worth renting. And that's it for this edition of What's All the Fuss About. Sorry, I've been kind of falling behind on this particular reviewing series, but the next one, number 96 on the list, is a movie called Do the Right Thing, which is very uncomfortable. See you next time.